Okay, so our panel is called, and this is where I stumble because I'm not quite sure how you pronounce the word. We've had a little debate about it, haven't we? Is fantasy by its very nature consolatory or consolatory? Whichever, that's the title.
We could just
of our
debate
panel.
that.
Shall we debate that instead? And with me, I'm not going to do long introductions, obviously, because we've only got half an hour, hence I'm speaking so fast. I have Peter Higgins, over there. Wolfhound Century is a kind of Soviet alternate spy story. I mean, it's out there. The cover is astounding. Ben Aaronovitch. What can I say about Ben? I'll stick with the books. Rivers of London series, and has written for Doctor Who, etc. James Barclay, Debonair Man About Town, has also written series of books, the Raven series, and Elves. And the lovely Joanne Harris.
As opposed to the really nasty one.
Well, yeah, that comes later in the bar. Whose most recent book, obviously, is The Gospel of Loki, which you've probably seen on Tube poster campaigns everywhere. And in fantasy has written her Raven books and many, many other things harking back. And so I'm not going to start by asking you the actual question, because I think we'll have a lot of no's rather than yeses. So I think maybe we'll debate it and then come back to the question. So I wonder if the fact that the genre that you all write in is called fantasy, to not the wonderfully literate and aware people in this room, but to the masses and the normal people, is it the normal people, do they see fantasy as escapism? Do they naturally assume it's escapism? I mean, when you're in those god-awful dinner party situations and people say, "Oh, you're a writer, what do you write?" and you say fantasy, do they go, "Oh," you know, isn't that, you know, that people have that. The normal people have this idea that it's a simple escapism genre. Would you say that is something that, because they don't see science fiction like that, you know? It's
I don't think they make the distinction. I don't think they make the distinction.
Expand.
I think when you talk about the normal people as opposed to people you go to dinner parties with, don't make a distinction between fantasy and science fiction. I think they see it all as a one thing.
Oh, I would. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I think they see Game of Thrones and they think of Game of Thrones as sci-fi or fantasy. They don't see themselves thinking, "Oh, Game of Thrones, that's fantasy," as opposed to, you know, Star Trek, which is sci-fi, or Guardians of the Galaxy, which is whatever that is.
Can be seen as
and no, I really don't think they make a distinction. I don't think, you said, what do ordinary people think? I don't think they
But do you think people,
give
as a rule,
toss.
think fantasy, because it's called fantasy, which is normally something you associate with a positive
Most normal
energy.
people think of fantasy as being about sex. When you say fantasy, yeah, go into a room and say, "What is your fantasy?" They're not going to say, "I think Legolas."
I don't know.
They are much more likely to, you know, describe something involving lingerie.
I can sort of say Jamie Lannister.
Yes, but it's, you know.
And suddenly those two worlds collide. Joanne, what do you think? Do you think people see fantasy in a kind of escapism way because they're sort of uneducated in the genre?
I don't think I get invited to that kind of dinner party.
Yeah.
But last time I did a mainstream festival, I was asked on stage by my interviewer why I had bothered to mess around with fantasy when I wrote proper books. I was very, very close to becoming the nasty Joanne Harris there and actually decking the interviewer. But I do think there's a general lack of understanding of how important fantasy is.
That's what I mean. It's
whether or not fantasy crosses over with sci-fi is, I think, a different conversation altogether. But I think people tend to think that fantasy is, A, discardable because it's not dealing with real life stuff, and B, terribly easy to write because actually you're just making the whole thing up. Whereas actually I think that fantasy is a deeply articulate way of coping with the universal psychological issues that we all have to deal with. Dealing with the fear of death, dealing with the desire for a happy ending, dealing with... They're basically fairy tale issues relocated to different parts of the kind of the psychic landscape. And as such, I would say that fantasy is the most articulate language in fiction because it gets right down to the bottom of what really matters to us all.
James, you're nodding.
I completely agree. It is the most.
And his books are available in the bookshop. The most important. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I was trying to ask was this idea that the tropes of fantasy are often come from... When I was little, I read a lot of fantasy, and I think a lot of young people read a lot of fantasy books in their formative years and don't necessarily carry it on into adult. So do you think maybe YA fantasy, and this is not something that I personally agree with, I'm asking you guys. Peter, I'm going to come to you first with this, so listen. I used to be a teacher, and now I've forgotten my point. Now, do you think YA fantasy maybe kind of is more consolatory than adult fantasy, or that's the perception that people then carry into adult fantasy?
No, not at all.
Good.
I mean, obviously I'm the first person to say no, it's not consolatory or consolatory, and but it just isn't. And children's fiction in particular is not.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree.
But I mean, if I can just come back to this point about Joanne's point about fantasy and it being the most important kind of writing, I find it very difficult to conceive of any kind of young adult writing that isn't fantasy in some form or another, and long form fiction is fantasy, and there's no difference in the tropes that you find in Homer or Paradise Lost to any kind of modern fantasy. And I think that there are people who will kind of put fantasy writing or science fiction writing into these, or young adult writing into these kind of their little boxes. But that's done for kind of political purposes almost, and self-defining purposes. That this whole idea of a kind of literary fiction that's different is a very new one. And the idea that some fiction is realist and some fiction is not, is a very recent kind of invention of the last 100 years, 150 years.
Yeah, I mean, I did think
it's just not true.
It could easily be called
all books
it's
are
fiction, consolatory, really,
yeah.
you know. So why did you each? I'm going to start with you, James, on this one, and then work down the line. Why did you choose fantastical settings or tropes for your works rather than what did it bring that you couldn't do in realistic, to use for a better word, settings? Why did you particularly want to?
Well, I think for me, it's probably because that's what I read almost exclusively as I was growing up.
So what did you read?
So my brother handed me books when he finished them. So he started with Tolkien, then went on to Moorcock, then on to Aldous, and then we had Ursula Le Guin. We had, I mean, how long ago? It's about 30 years ago or so, 40 years ago when I was starting to read all that stuff. I'm very old, nearly 50. And I guess that, and because I loved reading the fantasy and the science fiction so much, when I came to want to write my own stories, tell the stories of my own characters and my own people, it just seemed to make sense to set it in a fantastical surrounding, because that's what I was most comfortable with reading. It's as simple as that. And I don't have to be historically accurate.
Yeah, there's a fucker. Oh, sorry.
Potty mouth.
Ben. Because you've got this blend of crime and, you know, like gritty crime and this weird that goes on in
the
yours.
thing is, you come up as a writer, I'm sure this is true of all of us, you come up with really good ideas. Only some of them become best-selling books, and so everyone thinks you have done this, and this must be the thing that you do. But it's actually one of many, many, many ideas I have. It's just the one that everyone else likes.
I did hear, you have to tell the anecdote again for anyone who missed it, but I did watch your thing on the Gollancz Live. I don't know if anyone was following the Gollancz Live Festival today on the internet, but I saw your interview.
What, the crime and the
yeah,
yes.
I love that. Can you tell?
Okay, I when I worked at Waterstones, I ran the crime section and the science fiction section, and I like crime and I like science fiction. So when I came to write a book, I couldn't make up my mind which one to write, so I wrote one that was both. And it probably wasn't going to be science fiction crime, because that would involve a tremendous amount of research. Because I mean, unless you said it in the far future. If you said it in the near future, then you got to do kind of like, you've got to actually find out what kind of things like, just stuff. Like, there's just too much stuff. Whereas in fantasy, you get to make all that stuff up. And I was still working at Waterstone, so I had a limited amount of time to actually write the bloody thing. So it was fantasy.
And you wanted to write that you've missed the funny part.
I don't do because everyone gives me this blank look every time I say.
I am of the age, and so is Macaulay.
Okay,
and
well,
so is
maybe this audience is a bit older, but it's like, so why take 2 books into the shower when you can just write and go? You see, and I've stopped doing that now because I do this to audiences and they just look at me like, what? So I stopped doing that.
He did say in the interview, you have to be quite old to get that joke, at which point I stopped laughing in my computer screen. I was like, oh.
And also, then there was this whole bloody thing about shampoo, which was off the subject, so...
It did veer, but it was very good.
It veered very
I did
nicely.
like the idea of the blending of the
But
two.
no, basically, it's that's the idea that I had that's sold.
I love
I've had other ideas, but nobody liked them, so...
Joanne, why did you choose to? Because you've done, like, people kind of think of
Proper
you as,
books.
You've done the proper book, the literary proper books, and then you've done quite a lot of fantasy because you've got your Rune series, and then Gospel of Locacy is everywhere.
Yeah, well, I kind of think that all my books are fantasy, and that in fact it's just that mainstream publishing took quite a long time to understand this. And I have a sort of theory about fantasy in that it crosses over into a number of different emotional landscapes, if you like. I think the historical novel is almost exclusively fantasy because I've never yet read a historical novel that had all the little details that would make it a real historical novel. Nobody has bad teeth. Nobody has bad breath. Nobody hasn't washed for a year. Nobody has shaved off their eyebrows and glued on mouse skin eyebrows several inches higher than they were supposed to have because it happens to be the fashion. Instead, you still have the same people falling in love with handsome men and handsome women wearing cool clothes. And you think that's not history, it's fantasy. A great deal of what we perceive as mainstream is fantasy anyway. And this is why fairy tales and fantasy have kind of permeated all of the literature that we read, and some people kind of rather properly sit there and read what they think of as mainstream literature and Shakespeare and real literature, and they go, well, of course, fantasy is far too trivial for the likes of me. And then you actually have a look at the themes in there, and there's the quest, and there is self-discovery, and there is coming of age, and there is defeating the monster, and you think, hang on a bit, haven't I seen this somewhere before? And so I think actually everything that I've ever done has been fantasy.
Yeah, because even your more proper novels.
Well, people do come out and say, well, that's not
allusions
France.
towards- yeah.
That's just an invented France that you invented. A France where people, eat French food and have a good time. And has nothing to do with the real France, which is all about nuclear waste and the problem with immigrants and things. We choose our own areas to write about. And invariably, this selective process of cherry-picking what we want to talk about and putting it into a story automatically creates fantasy. Otherwise, we would be writing about litter and sewage all the time. And who wants to do
There's a
that?
market for that. There's a market for
I
a
guess.
shit story. Sorry, had to go there. Peter, last in the room. Spontan. Now, yours, I think, I was most intrigued about because you do, it's quite a bit like Ben's, this crossover of this sort of blend into Soviet Russia, but choosing to make it almost an alternative Soviet Russia. Why did you not go with Soviet Russia? And if you say research again, I'm going to put an X in the "Are Fantasy Writers Lazy?" box. Because was there something specific that made you want to do it in an alternate way?
It was the other way round, actually.
Okay.
In that I started with the idea that what I wanted to do was build another world, a different world, somewhere else, that would be interesting and that would generate loads of stories. And I wanted to make that feel and kind of smell and be much more like the first part of the 20th century than any kind of fantasy that I could think of at the time. And I wanted to be able to bring in all sorts of stuff and bring in not just kind of, not even particularly historical things, but little bits of literature and little bits of song, and propaganda and the feel and the atmosphere of the place. And as I started working on it and building up this world, it just turned into Russia. And so I didn't start from thinking, I want to write about Russia, but why don't I not do that? It was kind of like the Russia just kind of like bubbled up through the soil, and it just worked for me.
I think I read in the interview, and I might have got this a bit wrong, but and you'd said that growing up, the Soviet Union was kind of like this vast landscape that we didn't, as kids, you know, it was a terrifying, dark place that where the bad things happen, which is very much a trope of fantasy.
Not
you know,
in
I
my
hate
family,
you.
it wasn't. My family, it was paradise on earth and the hope for all mankind. Thank you very much.
Well, and also my family, you know, I lived there, and for me it was interesting to the Russians see the West in that capacity, and it's something that comes up a lot in fantasy, and I know it's, you know, you shouldn't generalize a whole genre, but there is this whole thing of that often is a sort of a dark land and a good land
That is real generalisation.
Yes, that's also about 40 years out of date, really.
fantasy writer.
Yeah, but I think that's right. I mean, I think there are these fundamental things that bubble up, and they bubble up kind of whatever you write about, really. I think, I mean, that having said very kind of fiercely at the start of this that no, fantasy is not consolatory, and of course it isn't, and what a bizarre idea that it would be. One of the reasons I think why, and this is all retrospective, I mean, this is all actually since I've wrote the book, and people have asked me why did I do it and all this. There is this feeling that I certainly have that I grew up in a world that was divided into two camps, the East Bloc and the West Bloc, and that whole kind of sense really saturated. And there was this kind of like idea of Russia as this huge thing that was out there. It's coming back a little tiny bit now, but I mean, people who weren't kind of really around at the time probably won't be aware of this. And it wasn't just the actual kind of Cold War and the idea that you look out the window and imagine that there would be a flash of light, and that would be the end of things. And the bombs had started, although that was really kind of part of it. There was also this huge thing about that Russia was everywhere, and books by people like Solzhenitsyn were just all over the place. And also this whole thing, which we haven't really talked about much yet, about kind of thrillers and John le Carré and that whole thing. And then in 1990, it all disappeared. And it was just gone. And I think since 1990, there's been this kind of really dramatic change with the whole kind of the coming of the internet and 9/11 and all of that. And we do really live in a different, in a very different kind of emotional and intellectual setting where things aren't clear and divided, and you don't have kind of men in raincoats and border crossings and pyramiter and all this kind of thing. Just does not happen anymore. I was in Europe just last week, and you just cross from frontier to frontier, and nothing happens. And so I think, in a way, writing Wolfhound Century, it was really kind of, in a way, kind of that recovering that whole thing and kind of looking at it and wondering what it's all about. And
there was something very romantic about the USSR.
Yeah,
I mean, a darkly romantic way. It had all the iconography and the massed choirs and the kind of like the socialist realist art and all that kind of the posters and everything, so that you could actually have a distinctive. You could put so you get a Soviet piece of propaganda art and you could put it on a wall and you would instantly recognise the style. You would instantly recognise the iconography as something else other than the other thing, and it had that kind of glamour to it.
And you guys were shaking your heads at this idea of my terrible thing about fantasy having this often, a bad place and a good place. How has that changed over the years? So what role would you say fantasy has in exploring the problems the world has?
what I think.
And is that by its nature consolatory?
Well, I think thematically you can discuss whatever problem you like. I mean, it quite often.
So what themes do you tend to work through in your fantasy?
Well, but political and religious themes, but also that this notion of probably quite good places which are inhabited by bad people.
Yeah.
So it isn't like a bad land over here,
Yeah,
but you get terribly bad people who are trying to create the bad land, but they're not. They don't live over there in my version of Mordor. They live all around us and within us.
And do you focus on, and this is for everybody, when you're coming up with your story, I mean, we all work themes into our books, but do you tend to have in fantasy an issue you want to work through, particularly in a book? Would you think, okay, I want to kind of explore, I mean, I've often wanged on with religion in my books. There's often an undercurrent of that. So do you have anything that bothers you about the world we live in and the effects we have on each other that you want to play with in your fiction?
I suppose but the only time I've consciously done that, and it was more a question of if something world-changing happened, what would it do to the status quo? Was when I did a pair of books where magic was introduced into the world in the guise of 4 small children, and what that did to an already creaking empire. And I suppose that's like the internet.
Yeah.
Look what that's done.
Look what it's done. It's
Brought
killed
the whole
my
world
work
crashing
ethic.
down.
Bookshops.
Ben, do you?
Class warfare.
Yeah, I knew you were going to.
Well, no, I didn't actually think of it until you said it, and then I thought, bloody hell, I've reverted to my parents' religion. And, as you do as you get older, you start lapsing back. So yeah, no, I didn't really, because I didn't realise that's what I was doing. But it's partly sometimes things develop out of the logic of stories. You don't say I'm going to do a story about this, then these are the elements I'm going to do. Sometimes you create the elements of a story, and then I'm generally a believer of the take care of the text, and the subtext will take care of itself.
Yeah.
So I usually find out what my subtext is about halfway through whatever book I'm writing. And then I think, well, I better integrate this into the story because it ain't going away.
Yeah.
So, but I think I've noticed a lot of class warfare creeping in. But that's because, the police is a largely working class organisation.
Yeah.
And so therefore, and my hero is working class, and so therefore, living in London, a London of the super rich and Cameron and the coalition and posh people. And so therefore, it's just going to come up regardless, because he's from a council estate, so it's bound to come up. In it, Keith.
Joanne?
I've been thinking while you were talking about this, and it seems to me that the big difference between what is perceived as mainstream literature and what's perceived as fantasy is a question of articulacy. Mainstream literature tends to internalise, and so you have a lot of characters sitting thinking to themselves and looking at each other and not quite expressing what they want to express, whereas fantasy is almost by definition expulsive. All the conflicts are external. All the monsters are real, and they're there, and you could identify them. And you can then, of course, identify with any element of that you like. But this is why, although perhaps not consolatory by definition, it is cathartic. Because even the most grimdark dystopian fantasy is cathartic because it allows you to work out problems and conflicts that may exist within you in a very clearly definable way. It is essentially about identifying monsters and getting the bastards. And the consolatory aspect of this is that in fantasy it is possible. Anything is possible. And this is why I think ultimately I do agree with the idea of fantasy being consolatory, because however many people die and however many puppies get slaughtered or whatever, ultimately there is this idea that not only can you face your monster, but there will be a way to face it down at some point.
Peter?
Yeah, I think the thing that I feel I'm most concerned about when I'm trying to write these books is maximising human perception and what you can say, how this articulacy word, I think it's a fantastic word, what you can perceive, where you can go, how you don't need borders and you can do different things, and you can have a book that's got fantasy and science fiction and it's a thriller and it's got some poetry and you can do all of those things and just push and push and push. And that, it seems to me, this is one of the kind of thematic reasons why I choose this kind of totalitarian Russian stuff, is that that whole regime was all about not saying things and not saying things and not seeing what you said and not saying what you saw. And my characters are kind of brought up against that and expand. And magic comes into it, and seeing golems and sentient rain, all those kind of things comes into it too. And it's all about just pushing outwards.
Because when I immediately saw the question of the title of the panel, I was on Twitter and Barclay was on Twitter, and we had a little moment, didn't we? Like the kind of author moment. But on reflection, on Twitter, I think that sums up all author moments. Really. You know, how's your deadline? I'm on Twitter. But my immediate reaction was that snooty. No, of course it isn't. It does this, that, and the other, and da da da. But then I thought about the question, and I thought maybe I was being derisive of the question. And actually, is it wrong for something to explore something to a length that it is consolatory? And then I thought, well, maybe, you know, for my answer for it would be that it's consolatory for the writer. How the audience perceives it is different. I mean, as we've literally down to our last couple of minutes, so answering the question, James Barclay, do you believe fantasy by its very nature is consolatory?
No.
Why?
although it can be. I suppose it can be sometimes. I think with the notion that quite often, or often in a fantasy novel, good will out at the end, then yes, it is consolatory or consolatory.
I still don't know. I just need
Whatever
someone
it
to
is.
tell me how to say it. Ben?
Not by its very nature, no.
Good answer.
Why?
A
30
star.
seconds.
Well,
Why? Because it just isn't.
That is a brilliant answer.
Because it just isn't. It just isn't consolatory.
So your answer is no.
Not by its nature, no.
Joanne?
I would say that in the long run, yes, because it is a kind of therapy. Sometimes therapy takes us to dark places. Ultimately, you are supposed to get better. I have never come out of a fantasy book feeling terribly sad and as if the world were at an end. Although sometimes the world has ended, and several times during the pages of the book. I think that feeling is what you get when you finish a fantasy book, and that's why ultimately you feel better, even if it made you feel worse.
Last word from you.
Yeah, no, ultimately I don't, because I think that it's stories that are either consolatory or not consolatory. It's the things that happen in the stories, and in particular, it's how stories end, and the whole thing about it is in the ending. And fantasy finds endings hugely problematic, because you build this world and you just don't want to end it, and so you end up with Robert Jordan or whatever, and
That's how you end up with like
and
15
things escape.
books in a series.
And good. So no, I don't. I think it's different to that.
3-book contracts is how you end up with 15 books. It's 5 contracts.
No, things escape from books. Like zombies escape and go off into other things.
Yes, they do.
But they don't. You can't end. Once if you've got a really good fantasy idea, it doesn't end.
And nor should it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's quite a terrifying thought, actually. There's nothing consolatory about that
No.
thought at all. So I would like to...
Game of Thrones could go
Game
on
of Thrones could go
forever.
on forever. Just don't kill Jamie or Tyrion.
Winter,
because
summer,
my
winter,
special
summer.
fantasy. That was an inside thought that should have stayed there. So I would like to thank my lovely, lovely panellists.